everyone. It is Ajanette, and I am here to address your Culture, Society, and Personality lecture, which is Module 2B. And you had an outside reading for this particular module through the Kelland text that was provided for you. It's Chapter 2. And so for this particular chapter, we are looking at the influence of culture and society on personality. Personality being the totality of our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. So, how you think about the world, situations, people, how you feel about the world, situations, people, and then how you engage those situations and people. All of that can be influenced by your surrounding culture. So think about your respective individual cultural identities, your ethnic identities. Remember back when we did the social identity theory reflection and thinking about particularly the ethnic and cultural identities and how those have shaped your thoughts of the world. For example, in Hawaiian culture, you often hear a reference to the aloha spirit, right? So we present in more of a hospitable, gracious way, and that is largely influenced by our culture. Sadly, that's been exploited over the years through colonization, but that's another story. So, here are some resources, and I do want you to explore some of these. Let me pull my little window down. I do want you to explore some of these. It's just really reflecting trends because historically our field was subject to scientific racism and sexism just like any other science, right? A large portion or a great chunk of our uh, scholarly knowledge comes from a Western lens, right? So it's very much shaped through a predominantly European lens. And it may not have not only an understanding, but an appreciation of the diverse cultural perspectives and backgrounds. So, and there's also an ethnocentric lens that comes with that as well, where they kind of center their own ethnicity and culture and compare things to the way they do things or the way they view the world or engage the world. And so there can be a hierarchical status that emerges, which is not always healthy, right? And so it really is in more contemporary times that we've been expanding. And we now have a field of multicultural psychology. You might, in some colleges, have classes that are specifically related to certain cultural groups. We have like the psychology of African Americans, we have the psychology of Asian Americans, and you in the UH system might experience some psychology classes that are geared toward studying Native Hawaiians or the host of other cultural identities that we have the privilege of experiencing in the state of Hawaii, right? Because it's a very global area that represents a ton of diversity. And so multicultural psychology looks at the psychological functioning of individuals within those respective groups, and it also considers the way in which their cultural background and their social and cultural structures may foster certain, worldview lenses and self-concepts. We also see an emphasis in our professions, right? In our respective roles, we are expected to have a multicultural lens and perspective. If you're a therapist and you are providing therapy and counseling and guidance, let's say to someone of an Asian background whose parents are more intimately involved in their decision making and their romantic relationships, in their social life, they're not allowed to transfer and go away to school for their university. all of those things might be influencing the decisions that they're making with their lives. And as a therapist, you want to be mindful of those things, and you want to be mindful of considering their culture and supporting them and affirming them in a way that doesn't conflict with their cultural identity and their cultural values. And there are guidelines that have been set forth for us as psychological professionals, including educators. As part of your learning activity, I'm going to actually have you review those guidelines and identify which ones might be related to your desired career. If you're majoring in psychology and you have a career in mind in this field, or a related career such as social work, which of these multicultural guidelines are going to be relevant to the roles that you're going to play, the responsibilities that you're going to have, and how might you consider your own identity and how that might influence you in that role. So I do want you to draw upon your social identity activity that you did, and consider that. As a matter of fact, pause me, go back, look at that, and consider those identities and the role that ethnic and cultural identity has played in shaping you and your life and your personality. And then finally, we talk about culturally responsive teaching. With culturally responsive teaching, you should see a variety of images and topics that represent diverse cultures in a classroom. You should have activities that embrace your culture and that promote cultural discussions and cultural pride. You should have a content and a professor that is fostering an inclusive and safe space where we can kind of showcase the different cultures with a spirit of reverence and appreciation for that diversity, rather than trying to change them, shut them down, or assimilate them into one set of ideologies, right? You should feel represented in the images and the content, in the activities. And there's going to be some degree of choice in your activities, or variety, where you're going to be able to express your learning in a number of ways, where you get to share with us your insights and thoughts, not always just regurgitate what's been shared with you. And so, again, please look at those, particularly as they relate to your desired career, and see what value they might bring, not just now in this class, but also later. So when we're talking about society and culture and how that relates to psychology, it's important to understand how culture's been really assessed in our field thus far. And again, it's been done through an ethnocentric lens. What do I mean by ethnocentric? If you break it down, it's centers, right? Centric being centers. And then additionally, ethno is the ethnicity. So really the way you're interpreting the world is centered around your own ethnicity. And because our scholarly research has come from a Western lens, we've largely interpreted knowledge, data, from a very biased perspective. The Western world only represents about 10% of the world's population. So when the other 90% of the voices have not been factored in to our database of knowledge, that's problematic, because it's wholly possible that those individuals would interpret that data differently, would see that world data, would even collect different data, right? So all of our theoretical frameworks in our foundational years were very male-centric and ethnocentric, and that is problematic. So not only do I want you to know them, right, as having a really good solid understanding of foundational psychology, but I also want you to critique them. I want you to look at the gaps in the research and the knowledge. I want you to understand how it may or may not apply to your individual cultures. And always consider that as you're weighting the value of that theoretical perspective. We also have had limited research, not just in our interpretation, but we actually have not intentionally gathered diverse samples, and that also is problematic. And so you might have a different way of studying a particular concept in another culture that hasn't been given the value and consideration that it should be. So we definitely want to engage in more cross-cultural research that includes not just comparing cultures, right? Because that's often what cross-cultural research does. It compares cultures, like how do we see parenting in in African culture compared to that of an American culture or some of the European cultures. Intercultural research is really looking at how cultures engage with one another, and that has not been as strong of a focus. I think in Hawaii, that's a great opportunity to do intercultural research. Also, any kind of college that has an international students program. America would have been a beautiful opportunity to study that as well. But sadly, because of that ethnocentric focus, assimilation was the kind of social norm where we expected people to abandon their cultural practices, traditions, and just blindly adopt, quote unquote, an American view. And in reality, allowing them to support, sustain, and even grow in their own individual cultural identities could have fostered a much more rich and engaging dynamic here in the United States. So another area that has been used to kind of categorize or discuss, investigate the field is emic versus etic tasks. So emic tasks are tasks like, think of like emic as in they're internal, they're applicable to me. So you see within a given culture that these tasks are familiar, they're common to those cultures. It's really important when you're looking at things from an emic approach that you recognize, like, let's say birthdays, right? Like, birthdays are familiar to me, but seen through my lens, and that might be perceived differently than maybe how birthdays are perceived in other cultures or how they're celebrated in other cultures. And so each culture kind of has a unique